I woke up giddy with anticipation and excitement in Cumberland, Maryland on Saturday, January 27th, 2024. I quickly found myself at the confluence of Wills Creek out of Pennsylvania and the North Branch Potomac River, which represents the Maryland and West Virginia border. The Western Maryland Scenic Railroad crosses this confluence as the day's Allegheny Winter Express emerged from the shops in West Virginia to reach the Cumberland station. The WMSR is why I'm in Cumberland today. The Scenic Railroad has been on my radar for years, and with the last weekend of January free, I decided to pull the trigger. I made this decision knowing full well that Mallet 1309 was not running, although the two B-32-8 locomotives were a great sight to see on this chilly morning. They were to be my subject for the day, with number 561 wearing patched paint and 558 the stunning fireball colors. It was really cool to be standing at the intersection of the two rivers, and even cooler to have it framed by the Western Maryland Scenic Railroad. I'm afforded this view thanks to Riverside Park, positioned directly across Wills Creek from the Cumberland station. The station is accessible via a footbridge spanning the creek, where I got a chance to poke around WMSR's assorted rolling stock that call Cumberland home. Most of the cars were hoppers from local fallen flags, such as the Baltimore and Ohio, Chesapeake and Ohio, and of course, the Western Maryland. These cars sit dormant for extended periods of time, only earning their keep when the Scenic Railroad puts on a photo freight charter. While the hoppers were cool, my interest was piqued by the Fruit Growers Express reefer. Numerous railroads of the 20th century split ownership of FGE, which allowed for easy operations of hotshot produce trains across great distances. Even cooler was the rail car positioned across from the FGE reefer, the Chambersburg Inn. This ex-Iowa Pacific passenger car had been part of 611's Shenandoah Valley Limited consist only weeks prior, and I was pleasantly surprised to find it again on the Western Maryland Scenic. I was pleased to have had plenty of time to sightsee at the Cumberland station and left before the train did, moving just over a mile north along Wills Creek to the Cumberland Narrows. The deceivingly named body of water is fed by the Pennsylvania Alleghenies, undoubtedly more ferocious in the late winter months as the mountains shed their snow cover. The Narrows drop into Cumberland while splitting two separate pieces of rich railroad, with CSX's Keystone subdivision on the east side and the WMSR on the west. The Keystone sub is home to the Chessie System's famous Sandpatch grade, while the WMSR's 15.5-mile line between Cumberland and Frostburg traces roots back to the Western Maryland. Two legendary railroads were once separated by nothing more than Wills Creek, both of which have folded into much different but just as prominent organizations in the modern-day railroad industry. We're 167 miles west of Baltimore via WM trackage, as the length of today's WMSR route is now paralleled by the Great Allegheny Passage. The GAP will hug the tracks for nearly the entire run into Frostburg, providing endless opportunities to achieve just as many angles of the Western Maryland Scenic. 10 minutes after 9 a.m. found B-32-8 number 561 bringing the morning's excursion north out of Cumberland as Wills Creek continues to rage towards the Potomac. This runoff will join the North Branch Potomac, pass through our nation's capital, and into the Chesapeake Bay prior to entering the Atlantic Ocean. I'd always read about the Potomac River, and while not technically on its banks, I was just as happy to be next door to one of its tributaries along the Western Maryland Scenic. I was thrilled that my chase was underway. I could have gone without stepping in mountain lion scat here at the Narrows, but it's a small price to pay to finally be trackside on the Western Maryland Scenic. The railroad had assembled a good-looking train for this occasion. I quite enjoyed the red and silver WM-inspired Pullmans, but can't deny that the inspiration looked best on locomotive number 558. Standard cab Dash 8s are desirable no matter their paint scheme, but this engine is a leader amongst its ranks. I was curious to see how easy chasing the WMSR would be. While the roadway and tracks part ways shortly after the Narrows, the scenic train never travels faster than 15 miles an hour. Add to that the intense climb uphill that 561 was facing, and I expected to have ample time at all my predetermined locations. Getting to these locations took me right next door to the Keystone Sub, and like a bug on blood, I felt the itch for Sandpatch developing. I knew I couldn't deviate from the world-famous Helmstedter's curve, constructed to help lift the tracks up what is nearly a 2% grade. The train and I are 4 miles from the Narrows here at Helmstedter's, and about 300 feet closer to the clouds. Helmstedter's is the Western Maryland's very own version of the famous PRR horseshoe curve, with similar appeal and practicality. Designed to lift the WM further into the Alleghenies, the grade at Helmstedter's is no laughing matter as the crew continues the steep climb into Brush Tunnel. Once back into daylight, the grade mellows out until the final push into Frostburg. The fittingly named town was my next location, where I had plenty of time to explore the rich railroad history that Frostburg provides. We're not on WM tracks anymore, but rather those of predecessor road Georges Creek and Cumberland Railroad. About 1.5 miles east of the station, the current tracks swing off WM property and onto that of the GC&C, which will take the train on the final climb into Frostburg. The Great Allegheny Passage continues on old WM trackage, no longer paralleling the current right-of-way, but still crossing paths multiple times. My advanced arrival at Frostburg allowed enough time to poke around and evaluate different photo locations as well, to which I decided I'd set up at the top of the town's Allegheny Passage trailhead. Looking down at Frostburg and northwards to the Pennsylvania Alleghenies, I was right next to a city-built coal miners' memorial with the Frostburg Station in the background. With the station to my back, I peered through the tree tunnel and down the impressively steep right-of-way, as my patience was eventually rewarded with the appearance of WMSR-8 number 561. The Scenic Railroad had acquired 561 in late 2023, and 2024's Allegheny Winter Express was to be the engine's first season on home rails. 561 most recently served on Altoona's Everett Railroad, a freight and passenger short line that routinely uses steam power, much like the WMSR. Everett leased the engine from the Northern Illinois and Wisconsin Railway, a trickily named locomotive leasing firm that sold 561 and 558 to the WMSR. You'll notice the previous owner's reporting marks still on the cab of 561, but not for long, as she is scheduled for a repaint similar to 558's once the outside temperature allows. .561 arrived to Cumberland following its sale in late 2023, where it was stored and prepped for 24's Winter Express. Contrary to 561, engine 558 was already in town when the ink dried on its sale. The engine had been on lease in Cumberland for a year prior to WMSR's acquisition of the two -8s, at which point it was promptly painted into WM colors, a large catalyst for my impromptu trip this weekend. Growing up, I had always loved Western Maryland's paint schemes, whether it was the simplistic black and gold speed lettering or the eye-catching black, red, and white circus scheme. While Western Maryland's speed lettering never included the fireball, the scenic railroad has produced an excellent interpretation, to say the least. Having seen some black and gold colors on display in Stanton only a couple months prior, I was thrilled to be chasing a Fireball -8 along the scenic short line. This only left the red and white scheme worn best by the railroad's GP30, which will make for an excellent excuse in the future to revisit Cumberland. The Winter Express's morning run only paused at the station for a few moments before heading back east. Passengers are given the opportunity to disembark and return to Cumberland on the afternoon train, which conveniently runs with an hour and 45-minute layover in Frostburg. I quickly punched in my first eastbound location to my GPS, with Spotify Shuffle setting the mood. I arrived at Trimble Road with time to spare yet again and decided to take advantage of the Allegheny Passage. There was another impressive grade in store for the Winter Express, this time 178 miles from Baltimore. I very much enjoyed how the trail paralleled the scenic rails, which lent seemingly unlimited publicly accessible photo opportunities all along the route. What an awesome scene. As the Fireball -8 ducks under the Western Maryland signal bridge, it becomes apparent how the parallel trail was constructed by removing a track. It's a myriad of history visible here, as Pullmans built for the FEC ride along an old Western Maryland branch line powered on both ends by standard cab -8s originally off the Norfolk Southern. Both of today's locomotives are still set up to run long hood forward, meaning the engineer is seated looking towards the rear of the train on the left side of the cab. A good thought on paper, LHF running is now just as much a rarity as seeing engines designed for it. I didn't think much could top the signal bridge scene, other than another roll-by at Helmstedter's, that is. When chasing trains leads me across the same piece of railroad multiple times, I usually avoid repeating locations in the spirit of experiencing the region as much as possible. However, some places are destined to be repeated, such as Helmstedter's Curve and the Cumberland Narrows. The deceptively named Wills Creek was still raging towards the Potomac as the sun made its debut just in the nick of time. The Western Maryland Scenic has an impressively high ratio of desirable photo locations to route miles, thanks in part to the Allegheny Passage. This justified the second of 3 reasons I wanted to visit the Scenic Railroad in order to personally experience the route in preparation to chase the railroad's Mallet number 1309. Experience has taught me that preemptive research is vital to productive trips, but nothing beats personally experiencing the area and taking note of desirable locations. Not that I needed justification to chase the Scenic Railroad today, but it will prove useful once I'm back in Cumberland for the 1309. My case in point, as I spun around to watch 561 saunter towards town, I noticed the rock face looming over the trail and tracks. I knew I had to be back there prior to sunset, but for now turned my eyes to CSX's Keystone subdivision. The old Chessie system line closely follows WM north out of Cumberland and through the Narrows, at times with less than 400 feet separating the two. In fact, the WMSR is just behind the trees atop the hill on my left, with the Class 1 directly to my right. I quickly settled in the shadow of Lover's Leap at a crossing off Mount Savage Road, the same mountain visible in my eastbound shot from the Narrows. This CSX grade crossing is less than 600 feet from the WMSR, exemplified as their afternoon winter express can be seen running uphill for Frostburg. While I made the trip to chase the WMSR, I also wanted to explore CSX's Sandpatch grade. With the unpainted 561 leading into a long layover at Frostburg, I had plenty of time before the 558 was back up front and could not pass up the opportunity to get some action on Sandpatch. As I was on the south end of the grade, a perfect world would have seen me follow a northbound uphill from Mount Savage, with enough time left over to chase 558's descent out of Frostburg. Both railroads must have had my best interests in mind, because that is exactly how the rest of the day played out. It all started with red-hot containers for Bedford Park less than 10 minutes after the Scenic Railroad had passed by. CSX train I-115 was my new best friend. This is a daily intermodal run between Chambersburg, Pennsylvania and Bedford Park, Illinois, with 108 platforms and all but one of their available spots accounted for. From here, the Keystone sub quickly crosses into Pennsylvania just before the town of Hindman, at which point I-115's battle with gravity would ensue up the east slope. Although the Sandpatch sub began in Cumberland, its famous grade does so in Hindman, climbing towards Sandpatch summit over a distance of roughly 20 miles. Traveling west from the summit, the grade is not as grueling, making the east slope Sandpatch's meat and potatoes, with grades nearing 2% and numerous beautiful vistas available. Of those vistas, I most desired Foley Overlook, 7.5 miles uphill from Hinman and 566 feet above it. Reaching Foley meant I put the sled in four-wheel drive as I drove up what has to be one of the most dangerous roads I've encountered while chasing trains. I guess if you're going fast enough towards the Old Fort loops, it might come close, but this was the real deal no matter the speed. Needless to say, I prioritized my safety over seeing I-115 again and carefully white-knuckled my way up to Foley. I now know why the Overlook is rarely photographed, but was enjoying the adventure wholeheartedly. After what felt like hours, I reached the lookout, positioned feet off the barely maintained roadway. I questioned whether or not I arrived prior to I-115, but a green signal beneath me on track 2 meant only good things. I got the drone airborne almost immediately, as I knew the intermodal had to be close behind. The Chessie Main Line has been hugging Wills Creek since the Cumberland Narrows as the two dig deeper into the Pennsylvania Alleghenies. They'll finally part ways a couple miles west of Foley, but for now made quite an exceptional show of nature and machine. It had been about 16 miles since my first encounter with I-115, and in all the excitement at Foley, I had failed to realize that the train was more or less ascending the same grade I had, only with about 5 million more pounds behind it. So I wound up having plenty of time at Foley before the intermodal arrived, but held out hope that it would do so before my drone's battery gave way. My good fortune had not worn out, as the train came into view with only a few minutes of juice to spare. Just as it was doing through the Narrows, Wills Creek was absolutely raging and could be well heard from my perch 150 feet above the waterline. But as I-115 took center stage and drowned out the rapids below, I was left with nothing less than a beaming grin. have been incredibly lucky to see many wonderful combinations of terrain and scenery across America, and am confident that this scene with I-115 paralleling Wills Creek from Foley Overlook earns a spot on the highlight reel. While the drone was only maybe more than 100 feet above my head, the train is hundreds of feet below it, providing some cool perspective as the heavy intermodal clawed its way uphill. The overlook sits about halfway up the east slope and is one of only a handful of accessible locations to railfan Sandpatch. While Foley is clearly best suited to shoot eastbounds descending into Cumberland, I cannot overstate my excitement as the sights and sounds of I-115's climb took over the scene. As the Chicago-bound stack train faded into the Alleghenies, I decided to make way back for Frostburg. There was still plenty of time before the WMSR would begin its descent into Cumberland, but I wasn't naive enough to think the drive downhill was to be any less adventurous than that of the one uphill, nor was I mistaken. The thrill was heightened by the lack of cell service, and although I wasn't 100% certain I was going in the correct direction, it was fun nonetheless. The third and final reason I had made this last-minute trip to Maryland was to hopefully see some snow, but I'd better be careful what I wish for next time, as it was slightly making a fool of me on the slippery drive downhill from Foley. Chasing trains all my life has done a lot of deeds for me personally, one of which is making me quite geographically inclined, if I do say so myself. Still without cell service, but back on some pavement, I saw what I figured were the same windmills visible from my hideout at Frostburg, and since I was heading south, I knew I must be on the right path. As if it was shining the bat signal, I soon found myself back at the Frostburg station, where 561 was enjoying its afternoon layover. The aftermath of my adventure to Foley was clearly visible, parked at the Frostburg trailhead down the hill from the train. It was a steep walk uphill until I found the 558 waiting for its passengers to board for the final run of the day. The LHF-8 has all the trappings of a Western Maryland engine, with the railroad's unique classification under the number, accompanied by the iconic radio-equipped lettering and a WMSR Fireball logo. The engine is underway not much later, sliding along the trail at a location called Parkersburg. The brakes were howling as the crew kept their train at bay, advancing down the impressive 2% grade just after having left Frostburg. Brakes were not the only thing to be heard, as the trailing generator car had been making a racket all day long. I suppose neither one of the Dash 8s are equipped with power supplies for the passenger consist, necessitating a generator car on at least one end of the train. The train has now left GC&C trackage and is now back onto that of the Western Maryland and will remain so into Cumberland. The Western Maryland Scenic's accessibility is unmatched. Not only does the Great Allegheny Passage follow almost the entire line, but it has a trailhead at every road crossing. Combined with the train's leisurely pace, this means that parking and walking up the tracks is incredibly easy and legal. That's exactly what I did here at Woodcock Hollow Road, perched atop a hill at what is one of my favorite spots from the day. From Woodcock Hollow, I was back for the third and final time to Helmstedter's Curve, where the impressive degree of curvature is put into perspective as I looked across the tracks at the oncoming train. Picturing Western Maryland coal drags along this piece of railroad is invigorating, and the Fireball Dash 8 was a good second. It was late January here in Maryland, the sun was setting, and the train breezing by me. I was chilly. I hadn't succumbed just yet though, as I still had one more trick up my sleeve at the Cumberland Narrows. Taking full advantage of the railroad's slow pace and photographic accessibility, I excitedly walked towards the rock face I had previously noted. This is what I mean when saying how all the maps and videos in the world can't possibly compare to personal exploration. Watching the WMSR along the Narrows was a great way to end my day trackside in Maryland. There's always a sense of accomplishment when wrapping up a good day of train chasing, as extensive planning and good fortune all fall in place nicely. It was a bit of a cannonball run driving to Maryland, chasing trains all day, and driving back to North Carolina, but that is all part of the fun of the hobby. Thanks for railfanning with me today. I hope you enjoyed this fun and scenic day of Allegheny train chasing as much as I did.